Hello, my name is David Andrew Lee Venable, and today we're going to talk about existentialism. What is existentialism? Well, aside from being a literary and ideological refuge for angsty teens and depressed adults, it is a philosophy that has influenced art, culture, and general thought from its very inception to the modern day. But what does existentialism mean? What does it stand for? What are its tenets?
The dictionary defines existentialism as a philosophical theory or approach that emphasizes the existence of the individual person as a free and responsible agent determining their own development through acts of the will. Professor Robert Solomon of the University of Texas defines existentialism as, quote, an attitude that recognizes the unresolvable confusion of the human world, yet resists the all-too-human temptation to resolve the confusion by grasping toward whatever appears firm or familiar.
In other words, it is a belief based in the fundamental concept of absurdity, that all attempts at finding reason in life are futile, as life itself is absurd. We are responsible for providing meaning to our otherwise meaningless existence, and this can be done by truly experiencing life and living it authentically. It is not to be confused with nihilism, the belief that life contains no purpose, no value, and that there is no such thing as morality. There is some philosophical overlap, including the concept of existential nihilism, but the two are actually separate concepts.
The earliest philosophers that could be considered existentialists would be Danish philosopher and Beethoven lookalike Søren Kierkegaard, who could very well be considered the father of existentialism. Kierkegaard wrote frequently about the individual, about the inherent angst, alienation, and despair of the human existence. He wrote of our need to come to terms with the inevitability of death, as few truly do acknowledge this harsh reality. The other proto-existentialist would be this man, human walrus Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote extensively on nihilism, which we refer to as a constant worth struggling against in one's everyday life. He wrote about the lack of objective reality, something existentialists would reflect on in later years. One of his most famous concepts is that of eternal recurrence, which posits the question of, if you were to relive this life from start to finish for all of eternity, would you do so gladly, or would you fall to your knees in despair? Another early example of existential concepts can be found in the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose harrowing and lengthy works discuss themes of suicide, morality, and religion. Such intense topics make sense for a man whose piercing eyes contain an intensity that haunts me to my very core. They just stare at you, into you. Early 20th century philosophers like Heidegger and Gabriel Marcel espoused concepts that would be important in the development of existentialism. However, existentialism would not be given a name, nor would it be practiced in earnest until after World Wars I and II. It would seem that something about the sudden realization that life and humanity were cruel and could end at any moment, due to nuclear annihilation, causes people to self-reflect on the meaning of it all. Perhaps the most well-known existential philosophers, if not the most impactful, though they may certainly be, are the French, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Simone de Beauvoir. Sartre is perhaps the best-known existential thinker. A playwright, literary critic, as well as philosopher, Sartre wrote about the nature of existence in both philosophical texts like Being and Nothingness, and his Nobel Prize-winning prose, Nausea, a prize he actually turned down, by the way, proclaiming it to be a bourgeois institution. Albert Camus wrote frequently about the absurd, to the extent that he refused the label of existentialist in favor of the term absurdist. His myth of Sisyphus compares the absurd nature of life to the Greek figure Sisyphus, who was doomed to roll a boulder up a hill just for it to roll back down for all of eternity. He compared Sisyphus's knowledge of the futility of this act to our own acknowledgement of the futility and absurdity of life. However, he did believe that the response would be to find joy in this absurdity, commenting that one must imagine Sisyphus to be happy. Simone de Beauvoir, a colleague and contemporary of Camus and Sartre, who was actually his life partner of 51 years, covered existentialism from a uniquely female voice, an early feminist who discussed the meaning of existence, sexuality, and the trials of womanhood.
Existentialist concepts can be found in various forms of media, from the proto-existential absurdism of Franz Kafka to the films of Terrence Malick and Stanley Kubrick. From Samuel Beckett to Andrei Tarkovsky, No Exit to Toy Story, themes of existence, reality, absurdity, and mortality are all indicative of an existential worldview. Now, existentialism is often described as depressing, and for sure, its traits and proximity to nihilism can lead one down a path they'd rather not dwell on. lest they be absorbed completely by the heaviness and potential negativity of these thoughts. As Nietzsche put it so eloquently, if you stare into the abyss stares back into you. And you may find yourself absorbed by self-doubt or filled with questions without answers. And,
Why am I here? If even the point of all of this is the reality I perceive comparable to that of my neighbors? How can I ever really know myself? Is existence itself futile when death is inevitable? Has any of this been entertaining or educational?
But I truly believe, and I think that most existential philosophers would agree, that existentialism is a philosophy that can actually be quite optimistic. It espouses self-awareness. It celebrates the freedom of acknowledging the absurdity of life and the ability to find your own life's meaning in the face of an otherwise meaningless existence. I find it to be as exciting as it is frightening. And when life is chaos, it's also a blank canvas. I'm David Andrew Lee Venable. Thank you for joining me. Have a good evening.